State made them look bad, But anyways, what about Ohio State and Alabama real quick before we get off the colleges, man? Do you think Ohio State can do – I think they can. I don't know if they will because I think that's going to be a hell of a football game. And Dan Wismar yesterday said he thinks whoever wins that one wins the next one as well and wins the whole thing, whether it's Bama or OSU. What do you think? Do you think Ohio State can take care of the Tide, or is Alabama and Saban going to have a little bit too much for them?
No, I think Ohio State can do it. The question is, will they get down early? If Alabama comes out early and gets the first 2 scores on the board, it's going to be more difficult for OSU to come back and keep up with them. That's really the key. The key is not to get down by too many scores too early. Then guys start, shuffling their heads and putting their heads down, and, they don't want to go to work, and they say, well, we're just going to get kicked out and we're going to lose this game anyway, and that's not the attitude to take. And, every time, and not that I ever coached at that level, God help you if I coached at that level, but, I've had some time where I've told kids, this is what makes you an adult now. This is what makes you go from a teenager to an adult. It's how you deal with adversity and what you do when you're faced with a crisis on the field. What are you going to do? And keep in mind, when your college football days are over, maybe 1.5% of these guys are going to get to professional ball of any type, much less the NFL. You got to worry about what happens after your graduation. Okay, you got to get yourself a career. You got to get yourself a life. If you're looking to start a family, you have to find that soulmate to start your family with and your career and go on with. And that's the most important thing. What's going to happen in your life after football, not whether or not you're on national TV doing a touchdown dance, on New Year's Day.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll see. With the defense of Alabama, too, and Cardale Jones, X Factor, going to be a lot of things. Plus, hey, the big spotlight of the first time this is ever went down like this. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it for sure, and it's the perfect setup. This next few days, there's going to be a whole lot of big football games to watch, a lot of fun ones on the college side, and then, of course, on the pro side as well as we roll into wild card weekend here. Quickly starting off with that, you and I can remember, and we weren't the only ones, but all of the guys on the panel that talk NFL with us from week to week, I can just think back to the middle part of the season going, this North is so competitive, man, that they're going to cannibalize each other and maybe get one team into the playoffs. So winning this division is going to be crucial. And, man, they got 3 teams in. 2 of them are going to meet each other here, which, and there, I always get into, I know it's 2 teams that I can't stand at all, but I always get into rivalry games that coincide with playoff games at the same time, because you're just going to take that intensity to the next level. But yeah, were you surprised that the North ended up getting 3 teams into the playoffs?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I was discussing this with the missus, who was also a big football fan, just a couple of weeks ago, and, she still doesn't understand how a team that wins less than 8 games can actually get into the playoffs. And, we had to go through a whole thing with the history and Pete Rozell's parody with Val Finchback and how the whole scheduling became the way it is, and, how a team gets in there and, that doesn't have 9 or 10 wins or even 8 wins. And, she just shook her head and said, there's something wrong with this league then. And I said, well, whether or not something's wrong with it or not, that's the way it is right now until they expand the format. And, we have 34, 36 teams before we can go to a 16-game playoff, and that's the way it's going to be. So, yes, there's a team when a team in a division like the NFC South only wins 7 games and they win the division, yeah, they don't belong in the playoffs, but you know what? They survived. So, I remember a couple of years ago when Seattle was just starting to get good, and they got in the playoffs with a 7-9, and they won the first game, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, they won, and they've only won 7 games in the regular season, and they won the first round of the playoffs." And I said, something has to change. And I said, well, blame it on Pete Rozell and Val Finchback, because they're the ones that created it.
Well, you gotta respect. You gotta respect the divisions. I mean, that's the only reason that I'm not gonna make a big deal out of that. I mean, plus, as you just mentioned, how many times has it happened? Exactly. There's a reason that.
Right. Well, that's what and that's what I explain to people. It happened 3 times in 25 years.
And so, to me, you don't tweak the status quo for fluke scenarios. That's why it's called a fluke. If it happens 3 times in 30 years, you don't need to change your rules. It's just that rare thing that happens, like some other rare thing that happens. Every once in a while, your car doesn't work right. It's not normal. You get it fixed and you move on. It's an anomaly. It's not the normal every day. So when people lose their minds over that and they go, we got to change everything and make sure that no sub 500 team can ever get into the playoffs, I'm like, well, you know what? When that becomes a consistent problem, then we need to change it. But then again, if that becomes a consistent problem, you got bigger problems than just that, because there's a reason that it doesn't happen, because it's so rare, because sub 500 teams don't win their divisions 96% of the time. So there's no reason to lose your mind and start looking to change all the rules of everything, you know? I mean, that's just my take on that anyways. But, you know, so looking at the North and these teams coming out, as I said, even though I don't like either one of the teams, you got a great primetime Saturday game there with the Ravens and the Steelers. They've got a big rivalry. It's technically the Browns and the Steelers. It's the old school Browns and the Steelers. But meeting up primetime Saturday night in the first round of the playoffs, that's going to be a hell of a game.
Yeah, it will be. And, you know, I have to reference a good friend of mine. And I know your chat room listeners are not going to enjoy this, but he worked for the Steelers organization for about 12 years, and he was a head coach at West Liberty State in West Virginia for another 12 years, and he's been around football all his life. Coach John Westenhaver, who's a Southern Ohio, currently a Southern Ohio native, and you know, Coach John said to me, you know, it's a terrible thing when a guy like Mark Trestman, you know, who's a good friend of his, gets canned after only 2 seasons when he was trying to restructure the team and the way the team operated. Not always are these coaching changes for the better, Jerry. And you know, when people say to me, well, what do you mean? I said, see, Oakland Raiders.
Oh, well, absolutely. You know, we'll get into that in a minute. I wanted to talk about some of the coaching stuff that went down, but before we do, I want to talk a little bit here about some of the other playoff matchups. You're of course Cardinals in your neck of the woods there. We know about the situations that they've had with the quarterbacks, and here they sit, and their reward, first-round playoff game against that sub-500 team that we were talking about, Carolina. Say what you will about them. They had back-to-back must-win games in the final 2 weeks of the season, the Browns, and then last week to win the division. They took care of both of those games, and they got themselves in their reward. And this is the part. Like, I can back off of complaining about a sub 500 team making the playoffs, but when they're hosting an 11-5 team, that's where you could see people going, hey, now wait a minute, the Cardinals had a hell of a season and their reward is to go on the road and take on the Panthers.
Yeah, and that's difficult because that stadium is difficult to play under any situation. And, you know, my favorite nickname for their quarterback, you know, I like to call him Scam Newton for the obvious reasons. And you know, it doesn't mean he's not a talented guy. He's very talented. And, you know, when I spoke with him a couple of years ago when he was drafted, I said, how do you get around all the negative hyperbole about what you've been through and become a successful professional player? And he said, I'm just going to put my head down and do what I got to do, Doc, and that's what's going to be. And people are either going to love me or they're going to hate me, but there's no in between. And, you know, this is an opportunity for the Cardinals fans to, you know, really put a hating on Carolina and Carolina's quarterback. And the question is, and we know B.A. is a great coach. You know, there's no doubt in my mind. And he deserves Coach of the Year, Coaching Staff of the Year. But, you know, this is not an easy task. They're a better team than 7-9. You know, they're really a 9-7, 10-16. They lost a couple of stupid games they should have won. And I don't know if that's coaching, you know, or if that's just poor play on the defensive part, you know, and they don't protect leads in the second half and the fourth quarter like they should. And, you know, that comes with maturity. You know, Kuechly's becoming a really strong player. I think another year or two, you're really going to see that, you know, he's in the top echelon of linebackers in the NFL. He may never be Mike Singletary, but, you know, he's got a lot of talent and he controls that middle very well. And that's going to be the difficulty for the Cardinals, is are they going to be able to run between the guards And I think they're going to have trouble running between the guards. They're going to have to run between the guard and the tackle or outside the tackle if they're going to have any success on the ground at all.
Yeah, and you know what, too? You mentioned, it's funny, talking about Arians, and I just think, and I say the same thing, I like Mike Pettine, but I said it about the Browns passing him up, but hell, the Bears had Bruce Arians, interviewed him, he's in the building, that was your choice, and instead they went with Trestman, and we'll get on it in a minute, but just because I just brought it back up to answer what you said earlier, I mentioned yesterday that I think, and I like Trestman, but he and his regime fell guilty to every single thing that you can screw up or do wrong as a rookie coach. He did them all wrong, and there's no. I'm not surprised that they did what they did, and the reason I say that is because they weren't used to that, and I'm talking about the organization. You can say what you want about the Bears and their ownership. What I'm saying is they had stability. For how long they had, it's just like in New York, how every end of season the media can't wait to move Tom Coughlin out of town and get the next guy in. But when you have that for a long, even if it becomes a joke at the end of every season, is Lovey going to go? Is Coughlin going to go? The guy stays, and then you do it another season, and then you play that game again, but the guy stays, and he ends up there for 10, 12, 15 years. Well, then eventually that guy does get moved out. You do lose the veteran, the stability, leadership, and I think it was a culture shock to go from. I thought it was polar opposites. You had stability, whether you thought Lovey lost his fastball or not. You had stability. You had a guy who had been there before and done that before, and then you go complete culture shock as an organization, and you go with the first-time guy. And I think that the Bears very quickly said, look, this is not acceptable.
Yeah, and that's true. They did do that. Maybe they did that a little too soon. But
they had Arians, though. How do you let Arians walk?
And I want to go back for a second because you mentioned Tom Coughlin, and I covered the Giants for a long time before I moved out here. And one of my favorite pictures is a picture of me hanging up on the wall of me interviewing Tom at one of his charity fund dinners and for the J Fund. And I spent a lot of years in the Timex Center, and even before that, in the Meadowlands in Giant Stadium before they tore the old building down. And I want to tell you something. Out back behind the Timex Center, okay, there is a little square pot of grass, okay, and in that grass is an empty headstone that will be engraved when he dies, because he will have to die to get out of that job. That is how much John Mara and the Tisch brothers love Tom Coughlin and Jerry Reese and what they've done for this franchise, and that they brought them, they're 80% in Super Bowl victories. They've won 4 out of 5. You don't do that, okay? And true, they didn't all come at once. And, I was at the first one as a fan, and I was at the second one as a media member, and I was at the third one as a media member, and, I was here in Arizona when they played the fourth one a couple of years ago and won. And, we forget about 2001 when they lost to the Ravens, and I know a lot of people felt the Giants didn't come in prepared for that, and that they shot themselves in the foot after the playoffs, and they had 2 big games against the Vikings that season, and they won one in the playoffs in the cold with icicles coming off the goalposts. People don't realize the commitment that organizations like the Giants and the Bears, well, in the military we call those plank owners, people who have started a unit. And, these teams are 2 of the teams that started the NFL. They're plank owners, okay? And just like the Browns started the All-American Football Conference in 1946, and I know right now LG is spinning in his seat there listening to this, saying, oh, my God, he brought up the All-American Football Conference. But history is history. There's a reason for that, J-Rock. Right. And there's a reason why these guys continue to play, because they understand history, okay? It's the same thing with military strategy. People study chess, and they study chess moves. It's the same thing with football and military strategy. Why do you study chess moves? Because if you don't have a good idea of what your opponent is capable of, you wind up on the bread and cheese line, like Mark Trestman is today.
Absolutely, on the bread and cheese line. And hey, you know what? I like Mark Trestman as an offensive coordinator, but I think he's one of them deals like Chud, where if you just keep him in that role, I think he could be very effective. But clearly, he was extremely overwhelmed. I knew he had done himself in The season was bad enough, and he was probably going to lose his job. But that stuff with Aaron Cromer and then sticking by him after he knifed your quarterback, whether you like Jay Cutler or not,